Well, good morning. I'm glad you could join us today. If you're looking for a better job, what are your prospects for the future? If you're counting on a 401k for your retirement, how will your investment do in the years ahead? Our guest this morning can't answer those specific questions, but he can tell us about the outlook for the U.S. economy, which will help determine the answers. That conversation is coming up right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, Dr. Martin A. Regalia is Senior Vice President for Economic and Tax Policy and Chief Economist at the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is the world's largest business federation, representing the interests of more than 3 million businesses of all sizes, as well as state and local chambers and industry associations. In conjunction with chamber members, he's responsible for developing policy on tax and economic issues. He appears on national television news and debate programs, testifies before congressional committees, authors articles and publications on a variety of economic topics, and speaks to many groups across the country. He's in town to speak to the Economic Club of Marquette County. We're pleased he could be with us today. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
You know, believe it or not, when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to do this, although radio was the media back then. Did you know when you were a kid you wanted to be an economist?
Absolutely not. I wanted to be a lawyer.
A lawyer?
And,
okay.
and make money and, enjoy life.
What was the path that got you into what you're doing today?
Oh, it was kind of funny. I mean, you have to take a variety of tests to get into to law school. And while I did very well on my grades and I didn't take the testing seriously. And so when the available law schools that I wanted to go to were kind of winnowing down, I said, you know, maybe I'll do something else. And I had a very good economics professor, and he said, well, you're very good at economics. Why don't you go in and do that? And I said, well, gee, can you make any money at all as an economist? And he said, you'd be surprised. You know, you can teach and do quite well, or you can, go into the political arena as a political economist. And that's the path I chose, and it just worked out well. So here I am.
What are your primary duties as Chief Economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
Well, the primary duties include watching the economy and putting together a forecast, trying to keep our businesses apprised of what's out there, what they're facing, as well as working with our members and who are on the our tax committee, our tax policy committee, and trying to put together good tax policies that we can then advocate for in the government and try to get things like tax reform passed.
You know, the economy is such a changing landscape all the time. How do you stay on top of all the things you have to be familiar with to be able to do your job?
Well, I've focused mostly on the macroeconomy and on the world economy as far as it affects the U.S. economy. And so there's, a variety of sectors that you look at. You look at consumption, you look at investment, you look at what's happening with the government and its budget and fiscal policies. You look at what's happening with the Federal Reserve. And having worked at a few different agencies around town, I worked at the FDIC, and then I did a stint at the Federal Reserve Board before I worked for a banking trade group and then came to the Chamber. You kind of develop a sense of what areas are going to be important. And just like when you look at a story and the first instance it comes out, you would look at it and say, oh, that's just not going to be an issue. Right. Another one you look at and say, oh no, this one's going to go places, this one's got legs. You do the same thing with the economy. You look at the data that comes out and you say, nah, that's pretty much a non-event. And then you look at another one and go, no, that's going to have some impact. And then you follow it and you kind of pick it apart and dig through the pieces and try to figure out what makes it work.
What's the message you're bringing to the Marquette County Economic Club?
Well, I think it's threefold. One is that you've really got to know where you've been in order to know where you're going. And this time around, our economic recovery has been pretty tepid, pretty moribund. In fact, it's the worst economic recovery on record. Our rate of growth, GDP, has only been about 2.1%. Our rate of productivity growth has only been about 1%. That's about half of what the average recoveries have been. Even when you look at job growth and the like, it hasn't been that strong compared to other recoveries. Wage growth, very, very tepid. In fact, if you look at total compensation growth, it's been 0.3%. There was only one other recovery in history, and that was that little midget recovery that occurred between the 1980 and 82 recessions, that little couple of month recovery where we saw wage growth that slow. And some economists don't even think that was a recovery. They just think that instead of being 2 recessions, it was only one that had a double dip. When you look at things like real compensation per capita, you see that the growth rate of only about 0.9%, again, almost by a factor of 50%, the worst on record in all the post-war recoveries. So people don't feel like they've gotten better. I mean, I travel around the country to a lot of places like the Upper Peninsula, and you know, I say, well, we've been in recovery now for 6 years, since the middle of 2009. I had one fellow in the back of the room raise his hand. He said, you know, my brother-in-law is still living in my basement. Until he moves out, I really don't think we're in recovery. And unfortunately, that's been the case.
You know, I know you've written a piece about the president looking to set his legacy as it relates to economic policy. And he's pretty much been in this recovery period. So at this point, the legacy isn't looking real strong in economics.
His economic legacy is probably the worst on record, at least in the post-war era. His performance has been really abysmal in terms of getting the economy growing. Some of that is just the fact that we had a very steep recession, that we had significant disruptions in the financial markets. But the other part of it, I believe, is policies. Things like the Dodd-Frank policy really paralyzed the flow of credit in this economy. Obamacare increased costs. He has been on a regulatory binge really since his first days in office. Many of those regulations are unnecessary, not well thought out. They've added one on top of the other instead of replacing older and obsolete regulations with new, more appropriate regulations. What we've done is just piled one on top of the other. We've affected the economy by piling on these regulatory costs, legal costs. We've increased taxes under his regime. And all of these things tend to sap strength out of the economy. And so it's not just happenstance that we're getting the worst performance, you know, certainly in the post-war era.
There is one particular, well, I guess all these issues affect us here in Upper Michigan in one way or another, but there is one that has a fairly major impact. We have an iron mining industry here, which is not doing well. We have a copper nickel mine, and we have some other potential copper mining projects on the agenda. But obviously the prices of commodities aren't doing well, and the global economy isn't doing well. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Well, the global economy has suffered as well coming out of the downturn in 2007 and 2008. And we saw the economy perform better in fits and starts. So Western Europe came out fairly quickly, and then they had the Greek debt crisis, and they slipped back into a recession. They've once again started growing, but paltry growth, very, very slow growth. The emerging markets came out pretty strong, in part because China was coming out. China had built its economy on an export model. We're going to produce it here, we're going to export it and sell it around the world. And that worked reasonably well in the beginning, and it gave them some very, very impressive growth rates. But they've tried to pivot their economy to more of a domestic consumption-driven economy, and that's been a difficult pivot for them, and as a result, they've lost some steam. When they lose steam, everybody they buy from loses steam, and one of the things that they were buying were these primary commodities to remanufacture. And so countries like Brazil, that were primary sellers to China, have seen their economy suffer in part because they were so dependent on China. In the U.S., we're not dependent on China to that degree, but China and the rest of the world do provide a venue for us to sell into, for us to penetrate and do well. So we do better when they're doing better. The fact that they're not doing so well right now is impacting the U.S. in general and impacting specific industries like the mining and extraction industry.
And iron mining, of course, is affected by steel, and now there are some issues about steel imports coming into this country. I don't know if you follow that issue at all.
Well, I do. We have a very large international division at the Chamber of Commerce, and we try not to tread too far into each other's turf. But in general, we have a situation where steel can be remanufactured or produced elsewhere abroad, and there's questions about how and at what price that should be bought back domestically. There's two sides to every argument, but it certainly is the case that we have seen our domestic industry at competitive disadvantages at times because of what's being brought in and at what price it's being brought in.
Probably starting in about 2004, 2005, Cliffs Natural Resources did very well. The prices of iron ore really skyrocketed.
That's right.
And right through the recession.
And because of places like China that were doing so strong and growing so fast at that particular point in time. And that created a very strong market for the extraction industries.
How much of this is manipulation on the part of the Chinese? And obviously they have a right to manage their economy. But
it's difficult to say because you have to have data in order to kind of make a judgment like that. And one is always a little bit suspect about the data that we get on the Chinese economy. Recently when their stock market had problems and it was, had a couple of tough days and was in a free fall, they just suspended trading. We're not used to that. We have an economy that kind of has certain market, dominated by certain market tenets, and as to how it should operate and how the government should react with it, they have still significantly different. They're moving in the direction of a freer market, but they still have a significantly different viewpoint towards the relationship between government and the private sector.
We'll get on to some more questions after a break. Back after 2 minutes on the Ryan Report. Our guest this morning is Martin Regalia, the Chief Economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve. I was in and out of my car, I think it was a week or so ago, when they were all waiting to hear the Fed Reserve's decision, and listening to the Fox Business News and CNBC, and I think they spent about 3 hours guessing what they might do, and then 3 or 4 hours analyzing what they did. Did the Fed make the right decision in your view?
No, I don't think so. I think that the Fed wanted to tighten rates. They announced over a year ago, May, that they were going to start to raise rates to try to renormalize, not to tighten policy that much, but really just to kind of tighten up on the slack. And that they would look at the data, and when the data was indicating that they should and could, they would. And unfortunately, they found reasons for not doing that. So there was a tremendous guessing game going on between the market and the Fed as to when they would tighten. Would it be in March? Then would it be in June? Then it would be in September. And a month or so ago, we got reports from the Fed that said, the data was moving in the right direction to tighten. Then all of a sudden, this last week, all the data is looking good. All the domestic data is looking good, that the Fed should tighten. And all of a sudden they decide not to, and then they say, well, it's because of China, because of what was happening in China and the Chinese financial markets. Well, the Fed directive is very clear. It says that you're supposed to create maximum growth subject to price stability. It doesn't say anything about the Chinese financial markets or the Chinese rate of growth. Now, the Fed doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so they have to take into account what would happen to our dollar and what that would mean for the Chinese economy and for other world economies. But that's not supposed to be primary. Primary is supposed to be maximum growth subject to price stability. And if you're going to look at that, then they should have tightened. Now, the guessing game was about 50-50. 50% said tighten, 50% said loosen. I was on record as saying I think they're going to tighten. Now, of course, when they don't, all the people that thought it was going to tighten have to vilify the Fed to prove that they were really right and the Fed was really wrong. But on this particular case, I think the Fed lost some credibility, and I think more importantly, they lost transparency. Janet Yellen was saying for a year, we want to be transparent. We want the market to know what we're going to do. And right now, it's just like the crazy old days when Chairman Volcker used to talk through a cigar and Chairman Greenspan used to mumble and use words like irrational exuberance that nobody really knew what they meant, and try to guess what the Fed was going to do. And I think we're back in those days, and I think that's not a good thing.
And they've really sent a pretty confusing message, I guess, to the market.
Oh, every time the Fed reports, I turn on the market measures, the Dow and the S&P. Right. And it was interesting because as the Fed report came out, the market rallied about 6 points on the S&P, 6 or 7 points. And then all of a sudden people started to think about it and they said, now what's the Fed telling us? The Fed's telling us that this economy really isn't doing as well as they were telling us it was doing a week ago. Right. And then it started to go down, and it sold off that afternoon. It sold off all during Janet Yellen's, rallied once or twice, but then ended up down significantly on that day, and then down significantly over the next couple of days, all the way through yesterday. Now today it looked pretty good this morning, but when the market does that, it's telling you that somehow you confuse them. And confusing the market's not something the Fed really wants to do.
We have to take one more break. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. And again, this morning we're talking with Martin Regalia, the Chief Economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You've already talked about the fact that this has been a very extended recovery and hasn't even felt like a recovery for many people. Where are we going? You know, are we going to see some improvement ahead? And where are the strengths of the U.S. economy going to be?
You know, it's hard to say because when you look at the forecasts that the government services provide as well as other private forecasters, most are looking for a very modest improvement over the course of this year, a little bit stronger growth in the second half, 2.5% to 3%. Versus the 2% or so in the first half. But then it doesn't go anywhere from there. And government entities like CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, pretty much project that we'll grow at 2.5, maybe a little bit better than 2.5 for the next few years. And then not much beyond that. And that's a problem because when you're only growing that fast, you don't get back to where you should be. We're seeing a lot of people in the employment market and the labor markets that are either not looking for jobs, that have pulled themselves out of the market. The participation rate is at a 40-year low. People are working part-time for economic reasons. That's a euphemism because they want to work full-time, but they can't find a full-time job. And these are the things which hold the income growth down and which hold the ability of people to buy what they want and to invest where they want. And that's a real problem. And unfortunately, I think the policies that this administration has implemented have left the economy in a permanently lower growth state. That means our potential rate of growth is lower. In fact, it's ratcheted down every year that this administration has been in office. And that potential rate of growth is the best measure that economists have of what we call the American dream, the ability for our kids and our grandkids, the next generations, to do better than we did. And so that slower productivity growth and slower potential rate of growth is a very, very serious problem now and in the future.
Unfortunately, we're out of time because I would have liked to follow it up talking about the fact that, you know, the American middle class is really kind of disappearing in some ways.
Very much so. It's not seeing the growth rates in their income or in their wealth accumulation that they have in past decades, and that's a problem.
Unfortunately, we can't talk about it much longer because our time is up. But thanks very much for coming in today to share your thoughts with us. Appreciate it very much.
Don, thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. We'll be back with some additional thoughts on the Ryan Report after we take this break. I was thinking the other day about words. Not surprising, since that's really what this show is all about. The use of slang words has become more and more prevalent and made its way into every part of our life. But sports seems to be particularly susceptible to this trend. I wasn't crazy about it when RBIs turned into ribbies. I liked it even less when home runs became big flies. But that's all pretty tame compared to what we hear today. Listening to the Detroit Tigers telecast provides so many examples. How about, "That guy is just dope"? Now, if you said that guy is a dope, those would be fighting words, because it would mean you were saying he wasn't very smart. But when you say he is dope, it can mean excellent or cool or super. Go figure. How about his performance was just sick? Doesn't sound very good, does it? But in fact, that reference is meant to say it was very good. When talking about a pitcher, we sometimes hear the announcer say, that pitch was just filthy, or it was dirty. Did the pitcher do something wrong? Was the pitch bad? No, just the opposite. Both are indications that a pitch was very good. And if he throws you a piece of cheese, that's not a good thing for the pitcher, but it is for the batter. It all has to be more than confusing for someone just learning the language. Since I opened the door to this subject of words not always meaning what they say, we can consider the fact that there are some common ordinary words that have more than one definition, and sometimes they're the opposite. Some words like fine, F-I-N-E, has several definitions. It can mean small or delicate, as in very fine grains of sand. It can mean everything's okay, as in that's just fine. And if you go into court, it can mean trouble if the judge hits you with a fine. How about the word left? If we said our friend just left, it means he's gone. But if we say there are 2 cookies left in the package, it means they're still here. And then there's the word off. Pretty simple, right? When I got home, I turned off the car. But how about I got up this morning when the alarm went off, which really meant it came on. And right after breakfast, I took off for work. Some words are spelled the same but are pronounced differently and have different definitions. R-E-S-I-G-N can be pronounced resign, as in I'm quitting, or it can be re-sign, as in I'm going to re-sign my contract and stay. Bewildering, isn't it? Can you imagine how confusing it is for someone just learning the language? And of course, I haven't even got to some of those that a lot of us are really stumbled over, like there, which has 3 different spellings and 3 different definitions, depending on whether you're saying over there is their house and they're not home. It's time to wind up this discussion. Now, if we were going to wind up a watch, it would mean we were just going to get it started. But in this case, it means we've had enough of this. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Well, our time is up for another Sunday morning. Time for us to make way for the Today Show. Our usual reminder that if you missed the show, it is available on the internet. Just go to uppermichigansource.com. Click the Features tab on the home page to find the link. And we're always interested in hearing just what's on your mind. Drop us an email at theryanreport@chesstv.com. I want to thank Martin Regalia for joining us today, the Chief Economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He provided some interesting insights into economic issues that will affect all of us in some way. That's it for now. Look forward to seeing you again next Sunday morning.